Maria Santos stepped off the military transport bus, her worn duffel bag slung over her shoulder. The hot desert sun beat down on Camp Thunder, making the sand shimmer like waves. She was 22 years old, fresh out of basic training, and this was her first real assignment. Her heart pounded with excitement and nervousness as she looked around at the sprawling military base. The other new recruits were already forming groups, laughing and sharing stories about their hometowns. Maria kept her head down and walked toward the barracks. She had learned long ago that it was better to stay quiet and observe before trying to fit in. Growing up in a small town in New Mexico, she had always been the outsider, the girl whose family struggled to make ends meet. As she entered the barracks, she could hear whispers behind her. Her uniform was slightly too big, and her boots were clearly secondhand. She had bought them from a thrift store because her family couldn't afford new ones. The other soldiers noticed everything, from her nervous habit of tucking her hair behind her ear to the way she carefully folded her few belongings. "Look at the new girl," she heard someone say. "Bet she won't last a week out here." Maria pretended not to hear. She had dealt with bullies before. In high school, kids made fun of her clothes, her accent, and the fact that she worked 3 part-time jobs to help her family. But she had graduated with honors and earned her way into the military through sheer determination. Her bunk was in the corner, away from the others. As she unpacked, she could feel eyes on her. The other female soldiers seemed to have already decided she didn't belong. They had college degrees, confident smiles, and families who supported their military careers. Maria had a high school diploma, a quiet demeanor, and parents who worried she was making a mistake. During her first week, the teasing started small. Someone would accidentally bump into her during drills. Her equipment would mysteriously go missing. When she sat down for meals, conversations would stop, and people would find reasons to sit elsewhere. Maria ate alone, walked alone, and trained alone. The worst part was during physical training. Maria was actually in excellent shape from years of manual labor, but the other soldiers made comments about everything she did. When she struggled with certain exercises, they would snicker. When she excelled at others, they claimed she was showing off. There was no winning. Sergeant Riley, their drill instructor, seemed to notice the tension but didn't intervene. Military life was tough, and soldiers had to learn to handle conflict on their own. Maria understood this, but it didn't make the isolation any easier. One evening, as Maria was cleaning her rifle, she overheard a group of soldiers talking about her. They were making bets about how long she would last before requesting a transfer, or washing out completely. The conversation was cruel and detailed, dissecting everything from her appearance to her performance during training. "She's trying so hard to prove herself," one of them said. "But you can tell she doesn't have what it takes. Some people just aren't cut out for this life." Maria's hands shook slightly as she continued cleaning her weapon. She had faced rejection before, but this felt different. These were supposed to be her fellow soldiers, people she might have to depend on in dangerous situations. Instead, they saw her as entertainment, someone to mock and exclude. That night, lying in her narrow bunk, Maria stared at the ceiling and thought about home. Her younger brother had begged her not to leave. Her mother had cried for weeks before her departure. Her father, a man of few words, had simply hugged her tight and told her to be careful. Maybe they had been right. Maybe she had made a terrible mistake. But then she remembered why she had joined. The military offered opportunities she could never get in her small town. It was a chance to serve her country, to build a career, and to prove that where you come from doesn't determine where you can go. She had survived poverty, family struggles, and small-town prejudice. She could survive this too. The next morning brought a new challenge. During combat training, the soldiers were divided into teams. Maria was the last one picked, ending up on a team that clearly didn't want her. Throughout the exercise, her teammates ignored her suggestions and excluded her from planning sessions. When their team performed poorly, they blamed her, even though she had followed orders. "Exactly. Santos is dead weight," she heard one of them tell Sergeant Riley. "We can't complete missions effectively with someone who doesn't pull their weight." Maria wanted to defend herself, to point out all the ways she had contributed, but she knew it wouldn't matter. Their minds were made up. She was the outsider, the one who didn't fit their image of what a soldier should be. As weeks passed, the exclusion became more systematic. Maria found herself assigned to the worst duties, given the oldest equipment and left out of informal gatherings where soldiers bonded and shared information. She began to wonder if she was being paranoid, but the pattern was too clear to ignore. The breaking point came during a particularly difficult training exercise. Maria had been working extra hours to master new skills, staying up late to study manuals and practice procedures. She was exhausted but determined to prove herself. During the exercise, she made a small mistake, the kind that happens to everyone during intense training. The reaction was swift and harsh. Her teammates acted as if she had committed a major failure. The criticism was personal and cutting, questioning not just her abilities but her right to be there at all. Maria felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. That evening, she sat alone outside the barracks, watching the sun set over the desert. For the first time since arriving at Camp Thunder, she seriously considered giving up. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe she didn't belong here. Maybe some dreams were too big for someone like her. But deep inside, Maria knew she had something the others couldn't see. She had survived things they couldn't imagine. She had fought for everything she had ever achieved. And hidden beneath her uniform, she carried a reminder of just how strong she really was. Soon everyone at Camp Thunder would understand what they had failed to recognize. The harassment at Camp Thunder had become a daily routine by Maria's fourth week. Every morning brought new challenges that had nothing to do with military training and everything to do with surviving the cruelty of her fellow soldiers. They had turned exclusion into an art form, finding creative ways to make her feel unwelcome without technically breaking any rules. During mess hall meals, entire tables would suddenly become reserved when Maria approached with her tray. She learned to eat quickly, standing near the kitchen where the staff worked, trying to ignore the whispered comments and pointed stares. The kitchen workers, mostly local civilians, began to show her small kindnesses, offering extra portions or saving the better pieces of fruit. They didn't speak much English, but their gentle smiles reminded her that not everyone in this place saw her as a target. The psychological warfare extended to every aspect of base life. During equipment inspections, Maria's gear was held to impossible standards. A speck of dust that would be overlooked on someone else's rifle became grounds for criticism and extra duty for her. Her bed was measured with rulers to ensure perfect corners, while others' sloppy bunks went unnoticed. She began waking up an hour earlier than everyone else, spending extra time on every detail, determined not to give them ammunition against her. Private Jennifer Walsh had emerged as the unofficial leader of Maria's tormentors. Walsh came from a military family, her father a decorated colonel, her brother a West Point graduate. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. Walsh had made it clear from day one that she considered Maria an embarrassment to their unit, a charity case who had somehow slipped through the cracks of military standards. "My father says the military is becoming too soft," Walsh announced one evening in the barracks, her voice carrying clearly to where Maria sat polishing her boots. "They're letting in people who would never have qualified in his day. People who don't understand what it means to serve with honor." The words stung because they echoed Maria's own worst fears. Had she somehow cheated her way into a position she didn't deserve? Was she really as inadequate as they claimed? These doubts gnawed at her during sleepless nights, making her question every decision that had brought her to this point. The physical challenges became increasingly difficult as her isolation deepened. During team exercises, Maria found herself working twice as hard to compensate for teammates who forgot to pass along crucial information or misunderstood her communications. She learned to anticipate their attempts to sabotage her performance, developing backup plans and alternative strategies. One particularly brutal week involved advanced weapons training. Maria had always been a good shot, one of the few areas where her background gave her an advantage. Growing up, her grandfather had taught her to hunt, and she had a natural steadiness and patience that served her well. But even this strength became a target for ridicule. "Figures the girl from the middle of nowhere would be good with guns," Walsh sneered after Maria scored consistently high on the rifle range. Probably learned shooting rats behind her trailer. The comment about trailers particularly hurt, because Maria had indeed lived in a trailer for part of her childhood. After her father was laid off from the mine, she remembered the shame she felt when school friends drove past their tiny home on the edge of town, the way she would duck down in her seat on the school bus. But she also remembered how hard her parents worked to provide for their family, how they never gave up even when things were at their worst. The breaking point of this phase came during a night training exercise. Teams were supposed to navigate through difficult terrain using only compasses and maps, working together to reach checkpoints scattered across the desert. Maria's team had been assigned the most challenging route, and they started an hour after the other teams, ostensibly due to equipment delays. From the beginning, her teammates made it clear they blamed her for their disadvantage. They questioned every direction she suggested, even when she was obviously correct. When they missed a checkpoint because they had ignored her navigation advice, they accused her of deliberately misleading them. The desert night was cold and unforgiving, and tensions ran high as they stumbled through rocky terrain with failing flashlights. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Walsh hissed as they crouched behind rocks, trying to figure out their location. "We're lost because Santos doesn't know what she's doing. She's going to get us all killed out here." Maria bit back her response. She knew exactly where they were and how to reach the next checkpoint. But her teammates had stopped listening to her hours ago. She could either let them fail completely, or try one more time to help them succeed, knowing she would get no credit if they succeeded and all the blame if they failed. She chose to help, quietly adjusting their course and subtly guiding them toward their objective. Her teammates never realized how she had saved their mission, too focused on their predetermined narrative of her inadequacy to recognize her contributions. They finished the exercise successfully but gave Maria none of the credit, instead telling everyone how they had overcome her mistakes through superior teamwork. That night, lying exhausted in her bunk, Maria made a decision. She stopped trying to win their approval or prove herself according to their standards. She would focus on becoming the best soldier she could be, regardless of their opinions. She would excel not for their recognition but for her own integrity and the people back home who believed in her. The change in Maria's approach was subtle but significant. She stopped responding to their provocations, stopped trying to join their conversations, stopped hoping for acceptance. Instead, she threw herself into training with fierce determination. She studied every manual, practiced every skill, and pushed her physical limits daily. If they wanted to exclude her, she would use that isolation to become stronger than any of them imagined possible. Her new focus didn't go unnoticed, but it was misinterpreted. The other soldiers saw her increased dedication as evidence of desperation, proof that their campaign was working. They had no way of knowing that Maria was transforming their cruelty into fuel for her own growth, building strength they couldn't see, and preparing for challenges they couldn't imagine. 2 months into her assignment at Camp Thunder, Maria had developed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate trouble. She could sense when her fellow soldiers were planning something by the way they clustered together, whispering with unusual intensity. She had learned to read the subtle signs that preceded their next attempt to humiliate or exclude her. The latest incident involved her personal belongings. Maria had been meticulous about securing her possessions, but someone had managed to get into her footlocker. Nothing was stolen, but everything was rearranged in subtle ways that only she would notice. Her photographs from home were turned face down. Her letters from family were shuffled out of chronological order. Her spare uniform was wrinkled and rehung carelessly. The message was clear: nowhere was safe from their reach. They wanted her to know that her privacy meant nothing, that they could violate her personal space whenever they chose. Maria stared at her disturbed belongings for a long moment, feeling a familiar mixture of anger and helplessness. But this time something else stirred beneath those emotions. A quiet, steely resolve that had been building for weeks. She carefully restored order to her possessions, taking mental photographs of exactly how she arranged everything. If they wanted to play games, she would be ready. Maria had survived poverty, family crisis, and years of being underestimated. A group of privileged soldiers who thought harassment was entertainment were about to discover they had chosen the wrong target. The harassment escalated during a particularly challenging week of combat simulations. The exercises were designed to test soldiers under extreme stress, pushing them to their physical and mental limits. For Maria's tormentors, it was the perfect opportunity to disguise their cruelty as legitimate criticism of her performance. During one simulation, Maria's team was tasked with securing a mock compound while under simulated enemy fire. The exercise required precise coordination and trust between team members. Maria had studied the scenario extensively and had clear ideas about strategy, but her teammates dismissed her input before she could fully explain her thoughts. "Santos, just follow orders and try not to mess this up," Walsh commanded, even though they were technically the same rank. We can't afford any of your amateur mistakes today. The simulation went badly from the start. Without Maria's strategic input, the team made predictable tactical errors that the instructors had specifically designed the exercise to identify. They exposed themselves to unnecessary risk, failed to secure key positions, and lost valuable equipment to simulated enemy action. When the exercise ended, they had failed completely. The debriefing session was brutal. The instructors, unaware of the team dynamics, criticized everyone's performance equally. But as soon as they were dismissed, Maria's teammates found ways to redirect all blame onto her. According to their version of events, she had failed to follow orders, communicated poorly, and demonstrated the kind of individual thinking that got soldiers killed in real combat. She's a liability, Walsh told anyone who would listen. In a real situation, her mistakes would get us all killed. I don't understand why the military is lowering standards to let people like her in. Maria listened to these accusations with growing fury. She had performed better than most of her teammates during the simulation, but the truth didn't matter when everyone was determined to see her as the problem. She began to understand that this wasn't really about her performance or her qualifications. This was about maintaining a social hierarchy that her presence somehow threatened. That evening, Maria sat alone in the communications center, using her allotted time to call home. Her mother's voice was warm and concerned, asking detailed questions about her health, her training, and whether she was making friends. Maria found herself unable to share the truth about her daily reality at Camp Thunder. "I'm learning a lot, Mama," she said instead. "It's challenging, but I'm getting stronger every day." "Your father is so proud," her mother replied. "He tells everyone in town about his daughter, the soldier. Mrs. Rodriguez asked him to bring your picture to show everyone at church." After the call ended, Maria sat in the empty communications center, feeling the weight of her family's expectations. They believed in her so completely, trusted that she was living up to their dreams for her future. How could she tell them that her fellow soldiers saw her as a joke, a charity case who didn't belong? But something in her mother's voice had reminded her of her own strength. These people at Camp Thunder only saw her circumstances, not her character. They saw her second-hand boots and her nervous habits, not the determination that had carried her through years of struggle. They had no idea what she was truly capable of because they had never bothered to look past their prejudices. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Colonel Martinez, the base commander, was arriving for his monthly inspection. This was always a significant event, but this time it would include individual performance reviews for newer soldiers. Each recruit would have a private meeting with the colonel to discuss their progress and future assignments. Maria's teammates saw this as the perfect opportunity to solidify their narrative about her inadequacy. They began subtly preparing their case, discussing among themselves how they would present her performance issues if asked. They seemed confident that the colonel would see things their way and potentially recommend her for reassignment or additional training. What they didn't know was that Colonel Martinez was not the kind of officer who relied solely on peer reports to evaluate soldiers. He had his own methods of assessment, his own way of seeing through surface appearances to understand what really motivated people, and he had been watching the dynamics at Camp Thunder more closely than anyone realized. Maria spent the days before his arrival preparing differently than her teammates. While they rehearsed their criticisms of her, she focused on documenting her actual performance through training records, test scores, and objective measurements. She wasn't planning to defend herself against their accusations. She was preparing to let her real achievements speak for themselves. The night before the colonel's arrival, Maria made a decision that surprised even herself. She would no longer hide or minimize her background. She would no longer try to fit into their vision of what a soldier should be. If Colonel Martinez wanted to know who she really was, she would show him everything, including the parts of her story that her tormentors had tried to use against her. Under her uniform, hidden from the daily cruelties of base life, Maria carried a reminder of her journey. Soon that reminder would become impossible to ignore, and everyone at Camp Thunder would finally understand what they had failed to see. 2 months into her assignment at Camp Thunder, Maria had developed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate trouble. She could sense when her fellow soldiers were planning something by the way they clustered together, whispering with unusual intensity. She had learned to read the subtle signs that preceded their next attempt to humiliate or exclude her. The latest incident involved her personal belongings. Maria had been meticulous about securing her possessions, but someone had managed to get into her footlocker. Nothing was stolen, but everything was rearranged in subtle ways that only she would notice. Her photographs from home were turned face down. Her letters from family were shuffled out of chronological order. Her spare uniform was wrinkled and rehung carelessly. The message was clear. Nowhere was safe from their reach. They wanted her to know that her privacy meant nothing, that they could violate her personal space whenever they chose. Maria stared at her disturbed belongings for a long moment, feeling a familiar mixture of anger and helplessness. But this time something else stirred beneath those emotions. A quiet, steely resolve that had been building for weeks. She carefully restored order to her possessions, taking mental photographs of exactly how she arranged everything. If they wanted to play games, she would be ready. Maria had survived poverty, family crisis, and years of being underestimated. A group of privileged soldiers who thought harassment was entertainment were about to discover they had chosen the wrong target. The harassment escalated during a particularly challenging week of combat simulations. The exercises were designed to test soldiers under extreme stress, pushing them to their physical and mental limits. For Maria's tormentors, it was the perfect opportunity to disguise their cruelty as legitimate criticism of her performance. During one simulation, Maria's team was tasked with securing a mock compound while under simulated enemy fire. The exercise required precise coordination and trust between team members. Maria had studied the scenario extensively and had clear ideas about strategy, but her teammates dismissed her input before she could fully explain her thoughts. "Santos, just follow orders and try not to mess this up," Walsh commanded, even though they were technically the same rank. "We can't afford any of your amateur mistakes today." The simulation went badly from the start. Without Maria's strategic input, the team made predictable tactical errors that the instructors had specifically designed the exercise to identify. They exposed themselves to unnecessary risk, failed to secure key positions, and lost valuable equipment to simulated enemy action. When the exercise ended, they had failed completely. The debriefing session was brutal. The instructors, unaware of the team dynamics, criticized everyone's performance equally. But as soon as they were dismissed, Maria's teammates found ways to redirect all blame onto her. According to their version of events, she had failed to follow orders, communicated poorly, and demonstrated the kind of individual thinking that got soldiers killed in real combat. "She's a liability," Walsh told anyone who would listen. "In a real situation, her mistakes would get us all killed. I don't understand why the military is lowering standards to let people like her in." Maria listened to these accusations with growing fury. She had performed better than most of her teammates during the simulation. But the truth didn't matter when everyone was determined to see her as the problem. She began to understand that this wasn't really about her performance or her qualifications. This was about maintaining a social hierarchy that her presence somehow threatened. That evening, Maria sat alone in the communications center, using her allotted time to call home. Her mother's voice was warm and concerned, asking detailed questions about her health, her training, and whether she was making friends. Maria found herself unable to share the truth about her daily reality at Camp Thunder. "I'm learning a lot, Mama," she said instead. "It's challenging, but I'm getting stronger every day." "Your father is so proud," her mother replied. "He tells everyone in town about his daughter, the soldier. Mrs. Rodriguez asked him to bring your picture to show everyone at church." After the call ended, Maria sat in the empty communications center, feeling the weight of her family's expectations. They believed in her so completely, trusted that she was living up to their dreams for her future. How could she tell them that her fellow soldiers saw her as a joke, a charity case who didn't belong? But something in her mother's voice had reminded her of her own strength. These people at Camp Thunder only saw her circumstances, not her character. They saw her second-hand boots and her nervous habits, not the determination that had carried her through years of struggle. They had no idea what she was truly capable of because they had never bothered to look past their prejudices. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Colonel Martinez, the base commander, was arriving for his monthly inspection. This was always a significant event, but this time it would include individual performance reviews for newer soldiers. Each recruit would have a private meeting with the colonel to discuss their progress and future assignments. Maria's teammates saw this as the perfect opportunity to solidify their narrative about her inadequacy. They began subtly preparing their case, discussing among themselves how they would present her performance issues if asked. They seemed confident that the colonel would see things their way and potentially recommend her for reassignment or additional training. What they didn't know was that Colonel Martinez was not the kind of officer who relied solely on peer reports to evaluate soldiers. He had his own methods of assessment, his own way of seeing through surface appearances to understand what really motivated people, and he had been watching the dynamics at Camp Thunder more closely than anyone realized. Maria spent the days before his arrival preparing differently than her teammates. While they rehearsed their criticisms of her, she focused on documenting her actual performance through training records, test scores, and objective measurements. She wasn't planning to defend herself against their accusations. She was preparing to let her real achievements speak for themselves. The night before the colonel's arrival, Maria made a decision that surprised even herself. She would no longer hide or minimize her background. She would no longer try to fit into their vision of what a soldier should be. If Colonel Martinez wanted to know who she really was, she would show him everything, including the parts of her story that her tormentors had tried to use against her. Under her uniform, hidden from the daily cruelties of base life, Maria carried a reminder of her journey. Soon that reminder would become impossible to ignore, and everyone at Camp Thunder would finally understand what they had failed to see. Maria stared at Colonel Martinez for a long moment, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it. This was the moment that could end everything, the revelation that would confirm every stereotype her tormentors had constructed about her. But something in the colonel's expression, the patient way he waited without judgment, gave her the courage to make a choice that went against every instinct for self-preservation she had developed over the past months. Slowly, Maria rolled up her left sleeve, revealing the intricate artwork that covered most of her forearm. The tattoo was not what most people would expect to see on a young soldier. Instead of typical military imagery or decorative designs, her skin told a complex story rendered in black and gray ink with remarkable artistic skill. The central image was a portrait of a young boy, no more than 8 years old, with large eyes and a gentle smile. Surrounding the portrait were symbols that spoke of loss and memory: angel wings, a rosary, dates marking a brief life, and script in elegant Spanish lettering. The entire piece was executed with the kind of detail and artistry that spoke of significant investment, both financial and emotional. Colonel Martinez studied the tattoo with professional interest, taking in every detail without the shock or disgust that Maria had learned to expect from people when they discovered her secret. After a long moment, he looked back at her face with an expression of growing understanding. "Tell me about him," he said simply. Maria's throat tightened. She had never spoken about Miguel to anyone at Camp Thunder. How could she explain to her privileged fellow soldiers that she had essentially raised her younger brother, while their parents worked multiple jobs to keep the family afloat? How could she describe the weight of responsibility she had carried since she was 12 years old? Or the way Miguel had looked up to her as both sister and mother figure? "His name was Miguel," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "He was my younger brother. He died in a car accident 3 years ago." The words felt inadequate to describe the devastating loss that had reshaped her entire world. Miguel had been more than her brother. He had been her purpose, her joy, her reason for working so hard to create a better future. When he died, Maria had felt like her own life had ended with his. "The accident happened while I was at work," she continued. "I had 3 jobs that summer trying to save money for college. Miguel was supposed to be at his friend's house, but he wanted to surprise me by meeting me after my shift. He borrowed a neighbor's bicycle and rode across town. A drunk driver hit him 2 blocks from where I worked." Colonel Martinez listened with the same patient attention he had given to her earlier account of harassment at Camp Thunder. He didn't offer empty condolences or try to fill the silence with meaningless reassurances. He simply witnessed her story with the respect it deserved. "After he died, I couldn't see any point in college or making plans for the future," Maria said. "I spent almost a year just working and helping my parents deal with their grief. Then I realized that Miguel wouldn't want me to stop living because he couldn't. He had always been so proud when I talked about my dreams, so excited about the adventures we would have when I finished school." She touched the tattoo gently, tracing the outline of Miguel's face with her fingertip. "I got this tattoo on the 1st anniversary of his death. Everyone told me it was a mistake, that it would hurt my job prospects, that people would judge me. But I needed to carry him with me. I needed him to be part of whatever I accomplished. The colonel made a note on his pad, but his expression remained neutral and professional. Maria couldn't tell what he was thinking, whether her revelation had confirmed or challenged his assumptions about her. She had gambled everything on his fairness, and now she could only wait to see if her trust had been misplaced. "Is that why you joined the military?" he asked. "Partly," Maria admitted. "After Miguel died, I realized how precious life is, how quickly everything can change. I wanted to do something that mattered, something that would honor his memory. He always said I was the strongest person he knew. I wanted to find out if that was true." Colonel Martinez closed her file and leaned back in his chair, studying her with those perceptive eyes. When he spoke again, his voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Private Santos, I want you to know that I have been observing your unit closely during my visit. I have spoken with Sergeant Riley and reviewed performance records for all the soldiers in your group. I have also made some informal inquiries about the social dynamics within your unit." Maria's stomach clenched. If he had been asking questions about her, he had certainly heard the version of events that painted her as incompetent and problematic. Whatever sympathy her story might have generated would be overwhelmed by the systematic campaign her tormentors had waged against her. "What I have discovered," the colonel continued, "is a pattern of behavior that reflects poorly on several soldiers in your unit, but not on you. Your performance scores are consistently above average despite operating in a hostile environment. Your tactical suggestions, when I could trace them through exercise records, show sound judgment and creative thinking. Your physical fitness ratings are excellent, and your technical knowledge is comprehensive." Maria felt a flicker of hope, but she was afraid to believe what she was hearing. Months of psychological warfare had taught her to expect disappointment, to brace for the moment when apparent support would be revealed as another form of manipulation. "More importantly," Colonel Martinez said, "I have identified a troubling pattern of harassment and exclusion that violates both military regulations and basic human decency. The soldiers responsible seem to believe that their family connections or educational backgrounds give them license to abuse fellow service members who don't fit their narrow definitions of acceptability." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the base where Maria had endured months of systematic cruelty. When he turned back to her, his expression was serious but not unkind. "Private Santos, I am not just conducting a routine inspection. I am here because there have been concerns raised about leadership and unit cohesion at Camp Thunder. Your situation is not unique, though it may be the most severe example of the problems I was sent to investigate." Maria felt a surge of mixed emotions, relief that someone in authority had finally seen through the lies and manipulation, but also anger that the situation had been allowed to continue for so long. How many other soldiers had suffered in silence while their tormentors operated with impunity? "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Colonel Martinez smiled, and for the first time, Maria saw something in his expression that looked like genuine respect. "Now, Private Santos, you discover what it means to serve alongside soldiers who understand the true meaning of honor and respect, and your fellow service members learn that actions have consequences, regardless of who their fathers are or where they went to school." The transformation at Camp Thunder began immediately after Maria's meeting with Colonel Martinez, though not in the way she had expected. Instead of dramatic confrontations or public accusations, the colonel implemented changes with surgical precision. Within hours of their conversation, new training schedules appeared that separated Maria from her previous tormentors. Equipment assignments were reorganized. Team compositions for upcoming exercises were completely restructured. Maria found herself assigned to Alpha Squad, a unit that had arrived at Camp Thunder 2 weeks after her, but had somehow avoided the toxic dynamics that plagued her original group. The squad leader was Corporal Jackson, a quiet professional from Ohio who evaluated people based on their performance rather than their backgrounds. The other members of Alpha Squad welcomed Maria with the casual acceptance that she had hoped to find months earlier. "Heard you're strong on tactical planning," Jackson told her during their first meeting. "We could use someone with those skills for the upcoming desert survival exercise. Think you're up for it?" The question was so straightforward, so free of hidden meanings or tests, that Maria almost didn't know how to respond. For months, every interaction had been laden with judgment and suspicion. Now she was being asked to contribute based on her actual abilities, rather than defending her right to exist in the same space as her fellow soldiers. Meanwhile, Her former tormentors were discovering that their behavior had not gone unnoticed. Walsh and 3 others were quietly transferred to different units where they would be under much closer supervision. The transfers were presented as routine reassignments, but everyone understood their true meaning. Colonel Martinez had made it clear that harassment and exclusion would not be tolerated under any circumstances. The remaining soldiers from Maria's original unit found themselves facing intensive counseling sessions about military values and unit cohesion. Sergeant Riley, who had failed to address the hostile environment, was reassigned to administrative duties pending a formal review of his leadership performance. The message rippled through the entire base. Personal prejudices and social hierarchies had no place in military service. But the most significant change came 3 days after Colonel Martinez's arrival, during what should have been a routine morning formation. The entire base was assembled in the main courtyard, soldiers standing in perfect ranks under the desert sun. Maria stood with Alpha Squad, still adjusting to the novel experience of being surrounded by soldiers who treated her as an equal. Colonel Martinez took the podium with his usual quiet authority, but there was something different in his demeanor. He carried himself like a man about to deliver a message that he considered personally important. When he began to speak, his voice carried clearly across the assembled troops without the need for amplification. "Soldiers," he began, "I want to share with you some observations about what makes a military unit truly effective. It is not the family connections of individual members. It is not their educational backgrounds or their financial resources. It is not their ability to exclude those who are different from themselves." Maria felt hundreds of eyes scanning the formation, some landing on her with newfound curiosity. Word had begun to spread about the changes happening at Camp Thunder, though few people understood the full scope of what had occurred. Military effectiveness comes from recognizing and utilizing the unique strengths that each soldier brings to the unit, the colonel continued. It comes from understanding that diversity of background and experience makes us stronger, not weaker. And it comes from refusing to allow personal prejudices to undermine our mission readiness. He paused, scanning the formation with those intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. When he spoke again, his voice carried additional weight. "I have discovered that some members of this base have forgotten these fundamental principles. They have allowed social divisions and personal biases to create an environment that is not only unprofessional, but actively harmful to military effectiveness. This ends today." The colonel stepped away from the podium and gestured for Maria to join him at the front of the formation. Her heart pounded as she realized what was happening, but Corporal Jackson gave her an encouraging nod. With as much dignity as she could muster, Maria walked across the courtyard and stood at attention beside the colonel. "Private Santos," Colonel Martinez announced, "has demonstrated exceptional performance under extremely challenging circumstances. Despite facing systematic harassment and exclusion from some members of her unit, she has maintained her commitment to excellence and her dedication to military service. Her tactical knowledge, physical fitness, and technical skills are exemplary." Maria stared straight ahead, fighting back tears as the colonel continued. After months of being told she was inadequate, incompetent, and unwelcome, hearing her actual achievements recognized in front of the entire base felt surreal. "But there is something else about Private Santos that I want you to understand," the colonel said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "She carries with her a reminder of why she serves, a symbol of the sacrifices that motivate her dedication to protecting others." Without being asked, Maria slowly rolled up her left sleeve, revealing the intricate tattoo that told Miguel's story. She heard sharp intakes of breath from soldiers who had never seen the artwork before, and she could feel the weight of hundreds of stares focused on her arm. This tattoo represents Private Santos's younger brother, who died in a tragic accident, Colonel Martinez explained. It represents her commitment to honoring his memory through service to her country. It represents the kind of personal motivation and emotional strength that makes soldiers willing to sacrifice for something greater than themselves. The silence in the courtyard was complete. Maria could hear the distant sound of wind across the desert, the faint hum of generators from the communications building, the subtle sounds of a military base in operation, but from the assembled soldiers, there was absolute quiet as they processed what they were seeing and hearing. "Some of you have chosen to judge Private Santos based on superficial characteristics," the colonel continued. You saw her background, her circumstances, her quiet demeanor, and decided she didn't belong among you. You failed to see her strength, her intelligence, her dedication, and her courage. You failed as soldiers and as human beings. Colonel Martinez turned to face Maria directly, his expression showing a mixture of respect and something that looked like paternal pride. Private Santos, you have my personal commendation for your performance at Camp Thunder. You have also earned something more valuable than any official recognition, the knowledge that you have proven yourself under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. As Maria rolled her sleeve back down and returned to her position with Alpha Squad, she felt a fundamental shift in the atmosphere around her. The hostile stares that had followed her for months were replaced by expressions of curiosity, respect, and in some cases, shame. Soldiers who had participated in or simply witnessed her harassment were beginning to understand the magnitude of their failure. But Maria knew that the real transformation was not in how others saw her. It was in how she saw herself. For the first time since arriving at Camp Thunder, she stood as a soldier among soldiers, carrying Miguel's memory with pride rather than hiding it in shame. The tattoo that had been her secret burden was now her badge of honor, visible proof of the love and loss that had forged her into someone stronger than her tormentors could ever imagine. 6 months after Colonel Martinez's transformative visit, Camp Thunder had become a completely different place for Maria Santos. The changes went far beyond the removal of her tormentors or the recognition she had received during that memorable formation. The entire culture of the base had shifted toward the kind of professional environment that military service was supposed to provide. Maria's integration with Alpha Squad had been seamless and natural. Corporal Jackson had proven to be an exceptional leader who fostered an atmosphere of mutual respect and collaborative problem-solving. The other squad members, representing diverse backgrounds from across the country, had embraced Maria's tactical insights and leadership potential with genuine enthusiasm. During the desert survival exercise that Jackson had mentioned during their first meeting, Maria's contributions proved invaluable. Her knowledge of desert conditions, gained from growing up in New Mexico, combined with her careful study of military survival techniques, helped Alpha Squad achieve the highest performance rating in the exercise. But more importantly for Maria, she experienced what it felt like to be part of a team that valued her input and trusted her judgment. Santos, Jackson told her after the exercise concluded, "I've never seen anyone read terrain the way you do. Have you considered applying for advanced tactical training? I think you'd excel in leadership development programs." The suggestion would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Maria had spent so long fighting just to be accepted as minimally competent that the idea of being recognized for exceptional ability felt foreign. But Alpha Squad had shown her what military service could be when soldiers focused on mission accomplishment rather than social hierarchy. Her relationship with the base leadership had also evolved significantly. Colonel Martinez had returned for follow-up inspections twice, and each time he made a point of speaking with Maria about her progress. He had become something of a mentor, offering guidance about career development and sharing insights from his own experiences as a soldier who had risen through the ranks based on merit rather than connections. The military needs leaders who understand what it means to overcome adversity, he told her during one of their conversations. Soldiers who have faced real challenges and found ways to succeed despite obstacles. That experience creates empathy and strength that cannot be taught in any classroom. The colonel's words had encouraged Maria to begin thinking about long-term military career goals rather than simply surviving her current assignment. She started studying for advancement exams and exploring specialized training opportunities. For the first time since Miguel's death, she was making plans for a future that excited rather than merely sustained her. The most profound change, however, was in how Maria carried herself and interacted with others. The defensive posture that had become second nature during her months of harassment gradually relaxed as she learned to trust that her fellow soldiers saw her as a valued team member. She began contributing to conversations naturally, offering suggestions without fear of ridicule, and even developing the kind of casual friendships that made military life bearable. One evening, while the squad was preparing for an upcoming inspection, Private Morrison, a soldier from Alpha Squad, asked Maria about her tattoo. The question was posed with genuine curiosity rather than judgment. creating an opportunity for Maria to share Miguel's story in a context of acceptance, rather than defensive explanation. "He sounds like he was an amazing kid," Morrison said after hearing about Miguel's dreams and personality. "I can understand why you wanted to honor his memory that way. My younger sister died in a climbing accident 2 years ago. I carry her picture in my helmet liner." These moments of connection, where soldiers shared their personal motivations and experiences, had become common within Alpha Squad. Maria realized that many of her fellow service members carried their own stories of loss, sacrifice, and determination. The difference was that Alpha Squad created space for these human experiences, rather than treating them as weaknesses to be exploited. The changes at Camp Thunder extended beyond Maria's personal situation. The base had developed a reputation within military circles as an example of effective leadership and positive unit cohesion. Other installations began sending officers to observe training procedures and leadership development, programs that Colonel Martinez had implemented. Walsh and the other soldiers who had been transferred were reportedly struggling in their new assignments. Without the ability to define themselves in opposition to a scapegoat, they were forced to confront their own performance and attitude issues. Some were apparently beginning to understand how their behavior had undermined not only their victims but their own development as soldiers. Sergeant Riley had been reassigned to a desk job at a supply depot, effectively ending his career as a field instructor. The official record cited his failure to maintain unit cohesion and address interpersonal conflicts. For Maria, this represented validation that the adults in authority positions were capable of recognizing and correcting systemic problems when they chose to take action. As her first year at Camp Thunder drew to a close, Maria received news that would have seemed impossible during those dark early months. She had been recommended for the Advanced Leadership Development Program, a competitive opportunity that would prepare her for increased responsibility and faster career progression. The recommendation came jointly from Colonel Martinez and Corporal Jackson, citing her tactical abilities, her resilience under pressure, and her potential to become the kind of leader the military needed. On the evening she received the news, Maria called her family to share her achievement. Her mother cried with joy and pride while her father's voice broke with emotion as he told her how proud Miguel would have been of her success. "Mija," her mother said through her tears, "you have become everything we dreamed you could be. Miguel's spirit has been with you every step of this journey." After the call ended, Maria walked out to the desert behind the base, where she often went to think and remember. The stars were brilliant in the clear night sky, reminding her of the many evenings she and Miguel had spent looking up at these same constellations from their backyard in New Mexico. She touched the tattoo on her arm, feeling the raised lines of ink that told Miguel's story and her own. The artwork that had once been a source of shame and vulnerability had become a symbol of strength and purpose. Every person at Camp Thunder now understood that Maria Santos was not defined by others' prejudices or limitations, but by her own character and determination. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. The Advanced Leadership Development Program would test her in ways she could only imagine. But Maria was no longer the uncertain young woman who had stepped off that transport bus months ago. She had discovered her own strength, found her place among soldiers who valued honor over hierarchy, and learned to carry Miguel's memory as a source of power rather than pain. The girl they had ridiculed for her background and circumstances had become a leader they now looked to for guidance and inspiration. Her mysterious tattoo, once hidden in shame, had become a visible reminder that true strength comes not from privilege or connections, but from love, loss, and the courage to keep moving forward despite both.